What can we learn by reflecting on the remarkable stories of how the former Confederate General Longstreet and the Union Major Merrill valiantly attempted to enforce the civil rights legislation during the Reconstruction Era? How were they able to protect the newly freed blacks from the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist terrorist groups? And why did the murderous KKK and White Leaguers have such broad support among the whites in the South and also among white Christians? And we reflected on the story in the book Bloody Shirt, Terror After the Civil War, to answer a very personal question. How could so many of my white Christian friends seem to embrace the false narratives of Fox News and Donald Trump, valuing cruelty over compassion? Now, Major Merrill showed considerable bravery both in his actions during the Civil War and in his first posting enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments in South Carolina after the war. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. General James Longstreet, a former Confederate general who became a pariah in the South when he changed his party affiliation to Lincoln's Republican Party, tried to prevent the insurrection in New Orleans. For his second posting during Reconstruction, Major Merrill attempted to reverse the insurrection of parishes on the outskirts of New Orleans. What was James Longstreet like? Our author, Stephen Budiansky, describes him as a messy bear of a man, 6'2", with an unkempt beard and a big hairy chest. Born in South Carolina, though reared in backwoods Alabama. He could ride a horse better than anyone. He was the best fence jumper in the whole Confederate Army. During the Civil War, General Longstreet was seen as a Confederate war hero and one of Robert E. Lee's most dependable generals. Our author writes that Lieutenant General Longstreet was Lee's senior corps commander and a stalwart companion in battle. Lee always pitched his tent near Longstreet's and enjoyed his good humor and sociable instincts. Longstreet gave advice, and Lee listened, even if he often didn't take it. Lee called him his old war horse. The affection was mutual. Longstreet named his son Robert Lee Longstreet. Our author writes that General Longstreet learned the hard way that what most of his fellow commanders, North and South, never did. That by standing on the defensive, an outnumbered force could let its attacker bash themselves to pieces first, but then could chew the pieces into mincemeat with a well-timed counterattack. General Longstreet strongly offered this unheeded advice during the Battle of Gettysburg, when he warned General Lee that a frontal charge against Union forces was suicide, and 15,000 rebels died marching into a volley of artillery and bullets in the fatal Pickett's charge. Longstreet and Pickett both reluctantly followed orders and did the best they could, and General Lee would ride among his men in the aftermath, apologizing to his men that it was all his fault, that he was the one responsible for this horrible decision. Now, after the Civil War, after Longstreet joined the Republican Party, after he became a Union general opposing the Ku Klux Klan, he was blamed by many in the South for the disaster of Pickett's charge, and he was even blamed for losing the Civil War for the South. And the Southern revisionists even tried to rob Longstreet of his close friendship with Robert E. Lee. When the Confederate forces were surrounded and cut off from their supplies after the Battle of Appomattox, James Longstreet advised Robert E. Lee that he thought General Grant would offer fair terms if he surrendered. Soon after the war, a grand jury indicted Generals Lee and Longstreet and other Confederate officials for treason, a crime punishable by hanging. General Grant objected and rode to the White House, threatening to resign if charges were not dropped, as he saw it as breaking the parole and surrender terms signed at Appomattox. President Andrew Johnson backed down, and the charges were dropped. In 1867, the editor of the New Orleans Times invited prominent Confederate leaders to share their views on the Reconstruction Amendments and Acts of Congress. General Longstreet wrote, "The surrender of the Confederate armies in 1865 involved the surrender of the claim to the right of secession, the surrender of the former political relations of the Negro, and the surrender of the Southern Confederacy. The political questions of the war should have been buried upon the fields last occupied by the Southern armies. One of the greatest errors was the opinion that we cannot do wrong and that Northerners cannot do right." When he made it known that he was endorsing Lincoln's Republican Party, his former friends and acquaintances shunned him and his family. And now we'll tell a tale of his suppression of the insurrection at New Orleans. Our author writes that on a late summer day in 1874, General Longstreet rode his horse through the silent French quarters and could see the barricades in the streets beyond. Our author continues, every wall he passed was plastered with the placards that had suddenly sprung up across the city, which read, "Citizens of New Orleans, for nearly 2 years you have been the silent but indignant sufferers of outrage after outrage heaped upon you by an usurping government. On Monday the 14th of September, close your places of business at 11 a.m. and assemble at the Henry Clay statue on Canal Street." And our author continues, 5,000 citizens responded to the call that morning in New Orleans. Doctors, bankers, lawyers, journeymen, clerks, and laborers, all gathering there at the foot of the statue of Henry Clay. Confronting this heavily armed mob, many of them Confederate War veterans, were 500 white and colored troops of the Metropolitan Brigade. They advanced past shuttered shops, bringing a gatling gun, an earlier version of the machine gun, 2 12-pound brass cannons, and 4 smaller artillery pieces with them. General Longstreet was violating one of his oldest principles of battle. He was taking the offensive against a superior force. Initially, there was a standoff between the two forces. The rebels piled up more barricades in the streets. The White Leaguers demanded that the rightful winner of the election was a segregationist Democratic candidate, and they wanted to overthrow the Lincoln Republican regime. Our author writes, around 2 o'clock, a detachment of White Leaguers marched over to City Hall and demanded the immediate surrender of the building from the mayor. And the governor then told his militia commander that it was time to take action and wait no more. So Longstreet had reluctantly ordered the change in plan from defense to offense. The Federal troops opened up with a gatling gun, cannon, and artillery, and for 15 minutes all guns were blazing from both sides. 31 men lay dead on the streets, mostly White Leaguers, and over 100 were wounded, including Longstreet, who was slightly injured. It was with great difficulty that the White League leaders dissuaded their followers from aiming at General Longstreet, which could have escalated the fighting. That night, General Longstreet reviewed the stores of ammunition. He was running low. This compelled him to surrender at the State House the next morning. He went home and was in bed for 6 months with a severe illness. The next morning, the train pulled into New Orleans with 2 passengers. The segregationist Democratic candidate who had lost the governor's race, John McHenry, and the area's commanding general of the United States, William Emory. Our author writes, these 2 men met formally. General Emory read a proclamation from President Grant. He ordered those who had combined together with force of arms to overthrow the state government of Louisiana to disperse. Now McHenry denied that there had been an insurrection and protested this act of military interference in state affairs, but said he had no desire to resist the armed force of the United States and would order his state troops home and turn over the state house, but only to the army. Now McHenry was placated with a staged ceremony of surrender, and a few days later reinforcements of 800 federal troops arrived, and the Lincoln Republican government was restored. But the insurrection was not quickly reversed in all the parishes surrounding New Orleans. Soon after, Major Merrill was posted in Louisiana. His dispatches to his superiors again voiced his frustration in his inability to enforce even the minimum of a sense of justice for the colored man. When the state government was overthrown by the White League in New Orleans, whites in the surrounding parishes followed suit. Major Merrill writes his superiors, the legal mayor of the town had practically abdicated, and his duties were being discharged by another man. The local police had been disbanded, and in its place was a volunteer force consisting of white citizens, many of whom are no doubt good men, but all are partisans of the so-called white man's party, and a very large proportion belonged to the violent White League. No civil process of any kind emanating from state authority can be issued or enforced, as legal officers had been forced to quit. When blacks or whites try to organize political meetings opposing the regime, these are broken up by the White League. By this time, the Union Army was arresting White League terrorists under the Enforcement Acts, not even bothering to go through the local courts. In one town, one of 3 men arrested was the mayor, and an angry crowd gathered and threatened to go after the troops. A few days later, a posse of several hundred men arrived with arrest warrants for 2 Union officers for a bogus contempt of court charge. Both the posse and the troops then departed for the local courthouse in Vienna. Major Merrill sent telegrams to his superiors and everyone who could assist in having these cases transferred to federal court. Our author writes that Merrill wanted no display of military force. He wanted to assert the law and set a clear precedent to discourage the White Leaguers for pulling such tricks again. The law was clear. Officials acting under the Enforcement Acts could not be arrested by state authorities. They had an absolute right to have habeas corpus cases transferred to federal jurisdiction. A few days later, Major Merrill learned that the court had quickly found the Union officers guilty and had sentenced them to 10 days in jail and a $100 fine. After a flurry of insistent telegrams, the court reversed its decision, freeing the Union soldiers. Later investigation revealed that the whole proceedings had been concocted by a White League lawyer who was conspiring with a local judge. Just as in South Carolina, he learned that White Leaguers in Shreveport were reading his telegrams. Everyone in town was in on the conspiracy. An Army colonel, Henry Morrow, was then sent from New Orleans to report on what was happening under Major Merrill's watch. Our author writes, Morrow talked to the white people and concluded that there was no need for more troops, and said it was unfortunate that the Army was stirring up such resentment by assisting in carrying out such unpopular arrests, and he recommended it cease doing so. He did not talk to any colored people, since he thought the Negro does not comprehend politics. And he concluded, the present state government cannot maintain itself in power a single hour without the protection of federal troops. Major Merrill departed to New Orleans by a steamboat to testify to a congressional investigating committee. He informed them that over 200 men had told him that they had been fired from their jobs for voting for candidates from Lincoln's Republican Party. He said that his life had been threatened, but he thought that the White Leaguers would not assassinate a federal officer. But then they asked, suppose you were to resign your commission and take off your uniform and go back to live there? And Major Merrill answered, I should then want to borrow a gatling gun at least. In conclusion, there are ominous similarities between the insurrection in New Orleans and the recent January 6th insurrection at the Capitol when Trump lost the election. The core reason for both insurrections was that the wrong party had won the election, and many felt that the election was not valid. And what was disheartening was the stubbornness of the former Confederates in Louisiana and other southern states. They eventually wore down the Lincoln Republicans and seized control of the government soon after all federal troops were withdrawn from the South after the presidential election of 1876, after which they denied the vote and due process to most blacks. Since the Republicans today are trying to deny the vote to blacks, don't think that this history cannot repeat itself. We have also recorded a video comparing the big lie that ignited the January 6th Capitol riots to the lie by the ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes that was a factor in the unjust trial and execution of Socrates. And we also puzzled over the wisdom of a son bringing charges against his own father for killing a slave in the Platonic dialogue Euthyphro. And we compared it to a son who turned in his own father for participating in the Capitol riots, and then talking about it repeatedly on national television. We also have videos on the over 10,000 lynchings that occurred in America during the Jim Crow era, and the similarities between Hannah Arendt's reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who administered the Nazi death camps, to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which views the black lynching and segregation experience to the Nazi Holocaust and race laws. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.